Mic test. Hello, good afternoon again to our friends from the media. We are here for our second press conference for the day. We are grateful for our two resource persons. We have Mr. Juan Paolo Guerrero. He is the network director of the organization called GIFT, or the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency. So he will talk about that organization and updates about global efforts to achieve fiscal transparency. And of course, as I heard from the sessions earlier, the Philippines is a part of that, I believe. Yeah. Okay, so let us hear more from Mr. Guerrero about that.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to share what we do at the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency with you. First of all, I would like to mention that I am very pleased to be before the members of the press. I started my professional career as a journalist many years ago in Mexico. I am a citizen of Mexico, although now as a director of GIFT, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, I am based in Washington. After I was a journalist, I became a researcher and then a professor, and then I became an information commissioner. So all my life, as a journalist, as a researcher, or as an information commissioner, I've been fighting for transparency, honesty, and less corruption in governments. So I'm a true believer of the advantages of fiscal, budget, government transparency. The Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency was launched in 2011. It is an event, it is a network that goes very close to the open government partnership effort. This network is composed by governments, and one founding government as a lead steward was as one of the most important leaders of this initiative is the Philippine government. We also have the government of Brazil, and we have international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the International Budget Partnership. So you have international financial institutions, you have governments, you have civil society representatives. And I would say that this last component, civil society representatives, is perhaps what identifies GIFT as something different from the rest. The fact of acknowledging that if you want open government, if you want open budgets to have an impact, you need not only governments disclosing information, but civil society to have access to that information, make it meaningful, use it, and take governments to account. The rule is very basic. There will not be a government that is honest if you don't have a demanding civil society requesting for that honesty, that efficiency, that service and good delivery of government that really addresses the people's needs. So this is what GIFT is all about. What do? We have a research agenda where we try to understand with rigorous methods the impacts of fiscal transparency. And there are many important impacts, and we have made research that make precisely the case about these impacts. One impact of fiscal transparency, just to name a few, is that governments are able to go out in the bonds market and get credit for their projects, for investment at lower rates. The cost of borrowing money at the financial markets is lower when you are transparent. Fiscal transparency has also an impact on governance issues. There are studies that prove that with fiscal transparency, there is more engagement of the people, there is more control from the people, and therefore, there is less corruption. Public services are enhanced when you have fiscal budget transparency, since the people get involved in the procurement of these services and the results are better. And you also have impacts in development features with fiscal transparency. So that is the research agenda. Another important feature of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency is peer-to-peer learning. And let me just share with you a recent experience we had in Brazil with Latin American countries. Brazil has been a step ahead of many countries in disclosing budget information. They have a very good website, a portal with all the information about their budget. Even having that very good experience, they were not at all satisfied because they put out there a lot of information about the budget, but little people were using it. So they recently went through a discussion, an internal discussion about how to enhance that website in a way that would really address specific needs and demands from the users of this information. And that internal discussion of the Brazilian government took place in front of other government representatives that were putting together their fiscal transparency portals in a way of taking advantage of the Brazilian discussion for their own decisions and designs of their fiscal transparency portals. So we had a 3-day workshop on fiscal transparency portals with the presence of countries like Mexico, Paraguay, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Peru. This peer-to-peer, this exchange between government officials and civil society representatives took place under the framework of the Fiscal Openness Working Group, that is one of the working groups that is active at the Open Government Partnership, which is this initiative of which I am aware, I'm sure you are aware of, because this is an initiative where the government of the Philippines was an important promoter since the beginning. So this initiative has working groups, one of them on access to information, another one on open data, and this other one on fiscal openness, which is led by GIFT. So there, what we do is put together civil society from different countries and government representatives to talk and learn from each other on the advancement of fiscal and budget transparency. A third area of work for GIFT is on norms. Norms, and the members of the network, we have the IMF, and we have the World Bank, and we have as a steward the OCDE. There you have the main standard setters in the world on openness, on fiscal transparency. Particularly, the IMF has the Fiscal Transparency Code. And recently, the IMF was involved in a revision of its code. The OCDE was also looking at a guidance for budgetary governance, and the International Budget Partnership, which has an instrument, a tool to measure budget openness, was also reviewing its tool. So we got together and we made these important standards to better converge. And as an example, they now all include a principle for public participation in the budget processes. GIFT has developed high-level principles on fiscal transparency and now is working on a guide, principles, a guidance on public participation on the budget processes. As you know, the budget is complex, and it is not difficult to have the people in general to engage, even when we know that it's very important that in some areas, in some processes, in some cycles of the budget process, it is very important for the people to engage. So when, under what conditions, what good examples do we have of people's engagement in the budget process? This is something that we are working on, not only from a normative principles viewpoint, but also engaging in an ambitious case study research agenda. So that's the norms work of GIFT. And finally, we work on open data. Disclosing budget information is not only through disclosing the documents that refer to specific phases of the budget, like for instance, the executive proposal of the budget or the audit report that is made by the Supreme Audit Institutions in most countries, but also relates to the disclosure of specific data about how is the budget being basically implemented. It is very important to disclose this information in ways that can be reutilized, that can be managed, that can be analyzed by anyone. Very few countries actually disclose budget information using open data formats. So in this the project, we've been working mainly with the World Bank that has an instrument, a tool for the disclosure of budget information using open data formats. It is called Boost, and we've been putting together government authorities, engaging them into disclosing the information with, again, civil society representatives to make sure that the data addresses the needs of the users and that you have a dialogue of the best ways to disclose this type of information. In these projects, we're working mainly in Tunisia and Paraguay. So this is what we do. I thank you again for your attention. Let me just underline that from the beginning, the President of the Philippines, through the Secretary of the Office of Management of the Budget, has been involved in GIFT, which means that we have been learning a lot about the efforts of the current government on budget transparency, of which my colleague will talk about in a few moments. But at the same time, the demanding, the request for the Philippines has been high at an international level, because they have been talking with partners from Brazil, Mexico, the United States, the UK, countries where there is always a lot to learn about these processes, but of whom there is also great opportunity to learn from. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now going to open the floor for Q&A. So the GIFT, admittedly, this is also the first time I heard of it, but I believe it is a very interesting organization. So may we ask anyone who wants to throw the first question?
I wasn't very transparent in one if you want, characteristic of GIFT, and this is how do we work? Where does the funding come from? So in case you were wondering, we have funds from the World Bank as a development grant facility, which is basically a grant for a seed money for the development of the network. And we also have funds from the Hewlett Foundation, an international foundation based in the US, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, related to Hewlett and Packard, but it's now a foundation that was formed by the founder of this company too, now unrelated, like the Ford Foundation. And we also have funds from Omidyar Network. So that's how we get funded. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we are opening the floor for questions. Who wants to ask the first question? Mika. For our recording, please state your full name and the name of your organization.
Good afternoon, Mr. Guerrero. I'm Mikhail Flores of Business World. I understand GIFT is also part of Open Government Partnership. And the Philippines is one of the 8 founding states way back in 2011. And it has been 4 years since we took part in the initiative. How would you assess the level of transparency by which the Philippines has improved from the time it became part of the initiative, and what are what improvements can the country still work on to further improve the level of transparency in terms of fiscal management as well as in the budgeting process of the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Although they are both multi-stakeholder initiatives, and we work together, we work with OGP. GIFT is very close related, although is independent. In other words, our governance and decision process is independent from OGP, even if we are part of one of the working groups, on the one on fiscal openness. In the last 3 years, we have witnessed a tremendous engagement and effort of this government for improve open government, fiscal transparency, and engage the people in many projects that are now implemented. One of the case studies that we have been studying at GIFT is precisely the Philippines, and the case study is published in the website, and we just produced an update of this study that will be available in our website in the next couple of weeks. What I will say that what can be observed is, on the one hand, that the variety of projects and new policies to advance openness in the Philippines government is significant, is quite amazing. Not only in fighting poverty, but in procurement, in budget transparency, their efforts in improving the index, the account or the rating of the open budget index has been quite significant. A couple of years ago, most of the documents related to the budget cycle were not accessible. Now they are. So you have a variety of areas where there is not only more transparency, but much more engagement from the public in audit processes too, for the budget, and audit control or social audits. There is also a significant commitment. It is hard right now to assess the impact of all these policies because they are very recent. What we know is that in other contexts, the impacts are positive. But 2 main components are still to see in the case of the Philippines. The first component relates to the real engagement of the citizens. I started saying that you will only have an honest, efficient government if the people demand it, if the people really question, follow up, and request for those services, that information, those results. So one component that we still need to see is to what extent the people will get engaged, involved, and will follow up on this new trend, on this new type of relationship between authorities and the people. And the second component is very related to this first one, and this is how much these policies are going to prevail, are going to stick, they're going to be institutionalized. That is another very important question. We've seen in many countries that there is advancement in openness, and after a couple of years, there are backlashes, and there is no continuity of the effort. So that is a significant question here, and that is why it is very important that the people, the beneficiaries, that is the population of the Philippines, get interested and engaged with these happenings, so they understand that these are basically recognition of rights they have, the right to know where their money is going to, or the right to know what their government is doing. And when someone tries to take that away, they respond in a way that it is too high of a political cost to take it away. That's when you can start thinking about policies that get enrooted in a system. And that is what we hope to see in the Philippines.
Okay, follow-up question, Mika?
Just a quick follow-up with the two issues that you mentioned. For the first one, in terms of citizen engagement, what do you think is the problem why the public has not reacted that much to the efforts of government to become transparent, and what needs to be done to improve the participation? And on the second part, on the continuity of the reforms, I understand, and most of us here are concerned of also of the sustainability of the reforms, given that by next year we will be electing a new set of political leaders. So what do you think should the present administration do, given the limited time that they have before the elections, in order to sustain and continue the reforms beyond the current government?
I understand that the Philippines has a long tradition of mobilization and of citizen engagement. It's a tradition that is very much related to the democratic process of this country. So from that viewpoint, you are starting from a good point. In countries like Mexico, where we had for a very long time one ruling party, but it was not a dictatorship as you can qualify the one you had before your democratic rule. Then in countries like Mexico or in other societies like Central Europe or former Soviet Union republics, civil society is not as engaged in social change. It takes many different factors to have the people much more in a disposition to claim for their rights. Fortunately, in my country, in Mexico, after 20 years of democratization, now I can say that people are much more active, and they're giving a hard time to the government whenever this government is not responding to issues like transparency or accountability. So here you have a pretty good, if you want, background for the people to engage. The challenge in issues like the budget or in issues like fiscal policies is that it's still a little bit technical, a little bit abstract. And second, people have the right to live their lives. So get engaged in government issues, especially when they're a little bit technical, is hard. That is why on these type of issues, you do have to work. You have to do training on two areas. One area, of course, is the people. You need to help the people understand that the budget is their money. It's basically money that is originated in civil society, but it has technicalities, it has complexities. So what happens in many countries is not everyone gets interested. You do have journalists that get interested in the budget, they write stories, and this is one of the ways of having much more people interested in how the money is spent. When you have a good journalist writing a story about any feature of the budget. So you do have to work with the people, and you also have to work with public servants. So they disclose information in a way that is meaningful, that is relevant, that address a specific interest of the people. So in this type of areas, besides the interest, the general interest, or the tendency to get engaged from the people which you also have, since these are technical issues, to work on both sides of the equation. Now, for your second question, again, what is needed in this type of reforms is ownership. And that ownership needs to come from the people. It is very difficult for governments to do reverse, to go backwards in something that the people believe is theirs. And little things belong more to the people than the money that is used by government, but actually is originated by their taxes, and in general, government issues. It takes some kind of training. It takes some time for the people to really assume these two rights, the right to information and the right for participation in public policies, decisions, and acts that affect them. I thank you for your interest. It's getting late. My colleague is going to have a much better story to tell you, so I'm going to leave you with him. Thank you.
Mr. Guerrero, for your closing, let me ask, over the medium term, what is your organization's goal? Where do you want economies go from here?
Well, we would love to the impact that fiscal transparency and opening the budget has had in countries like the Philippines or in Brazil. We will be very happy if this also happens. Well, first, that it sticks in these two countries. That is, that it becomes a practice that, like in other countries, is impossible to take away from the people. That's the first goal. So the consolidation of these reforms is one goal. And then the spread. We would like to work, like in the Philippines, in Indonesia, or in Vietnam. And the way we're working in Brazil, we would like to work in Paraguay, or in Bolivia or Venezuela, countries where transparency is still, to some extent, just a word, a dream, but not close to reality. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guerrero. Okay. Now we are going to have Mr. Shanaka Peiris, the IMF resident representative to the Philippines. Mr. Peiris will talk about some of the discussions earlier today, particularly on the issue of fiscal policy and on how it is important in achieving the goal of promoting equality and inclusive growth. So of course, when we talk about fiscal policy, it's both the manner of collecting taxes and government revenues, and the manner of spending public funds. So Mr. Peiris will elaborate more on that. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, as mentioned in the introduction, I'll kind of try to give you a brief overview of 2 sessions we had, which I think were not covered by the previous press conference, which covered mainly open data and procurement and transparency. So the 2 areas which we had sessions on today included fiscal policy for inclusive growth. In that session, really the discussion was how the tax system can be more structured in a way that promotes equity, so reduces inequality, and also is more efficient at collecting taxes so that it's less harmful for the economy and also the people. One aspect which focused on in more detail was on healthcare, how especially the health challenge going forward is quite large, and that taxation of certain products like tobacco, sin taxes like done in the Philippines could be quite beneficial in terms of improving health outcomes, but also raising revenues that could address the health challenges of tomorrow. And here we also delve into the case study of the Philippines, which was seen to have a lot of interesting lessons for a number of countries considering reforms in healthcare and health and other sin taxes. Then there was also, so that's the kind of revenue side. Let me go on to actually one more revenue side, which is from another session, but it's probably better to tackle that at the same time, which is on kind of public finance reforms and transparency on the revenue side. Here the focus was we need to create greater revenues for all the kind of social and investment needs we have. And one important aspect is to kind of broaden the tax net or broaden the tax base. Here, one key issue which is kind of affecting lots of countries in the region, in APEC, and especially in emerging markets, is the kind of tax incentives to attract new investments have led to a lot of foregone revenues and leakages. And the discussion was how do we rationalize those tax incentives so that we have a level playing field which is equitable to most, but also raises revenues which we need for all our priority spending. And here, areas we focused on is especially kind of what types of incentives are better, how we can make the granting of tax incentives and the processes more transparent and clear, and how we can monitor better and also disclose tax expenditures or foregone revenues to the public and Congress so that better decisions are made on the money of the people. And I think the tax interest rationalization bill and the TIMTA bill being discussed in the Philippines Congress is also relevant here. Another aspect we just discussed, which is related, is on the reporting of tax expenditures of foregone revenues is also important because this way people discuss what are the trade-offs of giving a tax break versus spending on healthcare or public investment. Here, 2 things came up. One was that it's very important that you have coordinating among agencies which are providing tax incentives, but also that the Department of Finance or the Ministry of Finance play an important role in managing and disclosing this information. That's kind of on the revenue side. Another area which is close to the revenue side is subsidies. There was a discussion on subsidy rationalization, especially because a number of countries in APEC also have subsidies, especially on fuel and energy. And the idea here was with the current global low energy prices, that it's a good time to reduce your subsidies and use that money to better target subsidies in general, but also when it comes to fuels, but use savings from those subsidy rationalization for more pro-poor and pro-investment expenditures. And we also discussed the case of Indonesia, which is doing it right now. Finally, a topic which is kind of one of the themes of APEC is really about the infrastructure push, how to have greater infrastructure in public investment, also in PPPs, to help have more inclusive growth. And here, we discussed how you need to have a better framework of project appraisal, selection, execution, implementation, and monitoring. And we discussed the different stages and what could help and what could be important to focus on the future, and also based on some case studies the IMF is working on. I think here there are some relevant things to the Philippines as well. One was that having a fairly overarching good public investment management framework is important, and that's something that the Philippines is trying to put in place, especially with the recently proposed PFM of Public Financial Management Law, which is coming through the Senate and from the House of Representatives, from a number of key senators and representatives from including the Ways and Means. So there it's all about putting the framework in, monitoring the spending, and improving execution so that we get more value for our investments, which are very important to foster inclusive growth. I guess I can take more detailed questions. Those are kind of two of the themes of the sessions we had today, and I'm sure there'll be more interesting themes tomorrow, but these are the two of the fiscal policy transparency and reform areas which we discussed this morning. Thank you.
Okay, there are questions from the floor, I believe. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm again Mr. Shane Velasco from the Philippine Information Agency. Good afternoon. May I ask your view? It is healthy to promote transparency and reforms, and we recognize that it is really important. My question is, it is healthy to have a transparency and reforms while we experiencing underspending on our national budget. What is the perspective of the IMF on that particular issue?
I think I'm understanding what you're saying. I think you're suggesting that there may be a trade-off between transparency and execution. It's not. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the important point to look at is actually one of the discussions we had today was on public investment management institutions and how that can improve execution. And the IMF is doing a study of 25 countries and also giving recommendations on how best to do this in the future for, the whole world, not only emerging markets, but for advanced economies as well. The key finding we have is that in most countries, especially in emerging markets and developing countries, the real bottleneck for public investment is lack of planning or weak planning in investment projects, the complexity of managing multi-year projects, so that your budget should be flexible enough to deal with those. Then, and also having better coordination between local government, central government, which is seen as a major issue even in some advanced economies. Another area to focus on is a lot about project selection and project appraisal. There, it's really about developing better project management, which requires a lot of work. Another area which we discussed is about monitoring project implementation through the execution phase, and also having the mechanisms in place to monitor, have the information flow. Again, here I would like to say is that, having the framework in place is very important, is one of the key lessons. And in a sense, Philippines, one of the reasons maybe execution problems have been arising is that Philippines didn't have organic budget law. So the framework wasn't very well spelled out in the expenditure, in the budget law, because Philippines didn't have organic budget law. And I mentioned there's a public financial management bill being proposed by a number of senators and House of Representatives. That would put in place and hopefully provide a better framework for execution and management of spending.
Is there any recommendation from the IMF in order to improve spending, in order to pump up the economy, and of course to accelerate the job generation?
As I said, from a framework point of view, we do think the current legislation proposed by a number of senators and the House of Representatives on the public financial management bill will address most of the structural bottlenecks being faced by the current expenditure framework. So that will address a lot of the structural issues if that bill is taken up. Of course, there are some short-term aspects which can probably be solved without legislative changes, and we do think that some of the measures being taken right now, especially with the administrative order of the president to accelerate spending in certain ways. You got to understand some of the changes and the bottleneck. I mean, the reasons things have slowed down in the last year or two, also adjustments to the Supreme Court ruling. And this bill also addresses some of the adjustments that need to be made for the Supreme Court ruling. But in the short run, there are some quick wins, and we do see spending potentially picking up, especially with the administrative order and maybe some issues about procurement, which seem to have been a bottleneck in certain types of spending addressed. And I think what's been proposed seems to be the right strategy. So we just have to look forward to the execution.
My last question. Any reaction from the IMF regarding the long overdue passage of the proposed rationalizations of tax incentives? Because currently there's a bill in the Congress in lower and upper chamber that there's so many tax holidays in our country, and the legislators wanted to consolidate it. Do you think it will attract more investors? It will not harm their intention to invest here because there's some kind of rationalization of the tax incentives that before, that is our strategy in the Philippines to attract investors, like for example what we did in Subic, in Clark. So what is the IMF perspective on the proposed bill? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure. I just want to clarify first. Are you asking about the TIMTA bill or about the fiscal rationalization bill?
I think he's asking about the fiscal incentives rationalization.
Okay,
bill.
fiscal incentive rationalization. I think I'm going to address both because I think that was both of those issues were discussed in the APEC, and it's not necessarily, I guess, IMF view. It was really reflecting what was discussed today, and most of us share similar views, which is that incentive rationalization is important, especially if you think the foregone revenues are fairly significant and is not taken to account in public finance decisions. So one important aspect is to have to know what the revenues foregone are, to discuss and publish it and see whether it's worthwhile. And that's the TIMTA bill, and therefore I think nearly everybody would agree that transparency everybody would probably support that. So the TIMTA bill is very important, and the current where it has been going, it would be considered kind of good practice from an international best practice perspective. Of course, what was proposed initially by DOF to also include it in budget documents, the values in budget documents would have been considered advanced practice, but we recognize that there was a decision to go to a more pure transparency angle, which will also still move it towards good practice. On the fiscal incentives rationalization, one thing is that, okay, in the TIMTA bill also there's been some discussion that it could harm investors. Doesn't seem any reason why it should harm investors because it's just transparency on incentives given and expenditures. So, and also the idea is to consolidate and have the information centralized. So that would be actually more understanding to investors, and you don't want investors going to different agencies and potentially playing any games. So it's a good thing on the TIMTA bill for the greater transparency. On the fiscal incentive rationalization, there are many aspects to it, and the bill's there are many versions of the bill, so I wouldn't want to comment too much. But the core idea, which I think most of us shared in the APEC, is that you want to broaden a base, which will potentially have you lower rates so that you have a fair system across the region, but also that you want to rely more on cost-based measures rather than profit measures. So avoid very large tax holidays because they are large losses of revenues and often don't necessarily lead to the specific investment, are very generalized, so some people can benefit even though they're highly profitable. So redundancies would be less, and also investment would be potentially higher if you rationalize away from pure tax holidays to more other types of tax investments like depreciation, accelerated depreciation, and reduce the amount of tax holidays, which seems to be the framework of some of the bills in Congress. And another issue also was to try to have the eligible sectors more clear-cut and linked to the real objectives rather than any very broad sectors or strategies. So have it much more clear to the objective you're trying to achieve with, and better target those incentives to those objectives. That was the kind of the gist of the, and I think some of the incentive rationalization bills go in that direction.
Any more questions from the floor? Chino, Leiko.
Hi, sir. I'm Chino Leiko, Manila Bulletin. This
Yeah.
is related to the first question about
Sure.
the bills pending in Congress. I have three issues. The first, these are proposals. One of them is now pending in Congress. The first one is the proposal about the sugar sweetened beverages bill. What's your stand on this proposal? The other, well, these are not yet filed in Congress. There is this proposal on higher excise tax on oil, and part of the comprehensive tax reform being proposed by the DUF is higher VAT. So may I know your stand on that, on those issues?
Okay, I'm going to answer it a bit more generally because I want to keep it a bit more to what was discussed today. So I don't want to answer it because it's supposed to be also a kind of APEC related. But actually, most of these issues were discussed, at least the first two. So as I said, we discussed about kind of targeted measures for healthcare, like the sin taxes, which are very successful. So the sweetened beverages would be seen as in that light, as seen that if it's something, if it's a measure which is clear-cut in the sense of potentially positive health outcomes with low inelastic demand, which also, where there is some inelasticity in demand, but also you get additional revenues, it would be seen generally as a fairly good target measure for better outcomes, but also more revenues. That's one. On the second one about fuel excises, as a part of comprehensive taxation, raising fuel excises, like we discussed that there was an important rationale today for doing subsidy rationalization on fuel because prices have gone down. There's a similar argument that this is a very good time to have a rationalization of fuel excise taxes because prices have gone down, so the real burden of those taxes have come down. So for the environment, like the sin taxes are good for health outcome, fuel taxes would be good for the environment and also good for revenue, especially because the tax revenues from those have fallen, and also, although the real taxation rate has gone down. So it would be seen as a very good, those two measures would be seen as very good. This could be a part of a comprehensive tax reform, and in general, principles we discussed at APEC were, you want to have inclusive taxes, where you want to have greater progressivity of tax system. So if these measures, for example, are used, like these fuel taxes or the beverages are used to make the system more progressive, for example, by tackling PIT taxation, that could be a very good inclusive growth package the way we discussed here. On VAT, I don't want to really discuss because we didn't really address VAT. So I would just leave it as saying, if you go for a comprehensive tax reform, what we discussed was, very nice ways to do it is to tax things like, the health outcomes better, what you mentioned, beverages could be that, environment, where it could be linked to fuel taxes, but also gives you good revenues. And those revenues could help you potentially have a comprehensive tax which is more inclusive, for example, by having PIT reform. On the VAT, again, you have to look at the whole comprehensive taxes, and most of us would generally agree that we should go for a comprehensive. But it will all depend on the package. Thank you.
Okay, we can entertain one or two more quick questions. Yes, Mika.
Good afternoon, Mr. Peiris. Mikhail Flores of Business World. Sir, I understand sin tax reform was also discussed in today's discussions.
Yeah.
From the revenue side, the BIR has been diligently reporting that sin tax collections have, for the most part, breached the government's target. But on the expenditure side, the government has been quite silent. So has the higher sin tax collections translated into better health programs? And has health related programs and projects been affected by the bottlenecks that that the government continues to experience in terms of disbursing the funds. Thank you.
Well, I mean, as you said, the projections for sin tax revenues have exceeded the program of the projection. So in that sense, it's been a net revenue enhancer and a very important measure. And one of the big aspects of the sin tax measure was to fund PhilHealth, universal health care, especially for the poorer segments of the population. And if you look at the enrollments, especially from the poor, have gone up a lot. So the enrollments have taken place. So the objectives of the sin tax, to a large extent, of enrolling the poor have been met. Whether the spending, is also determined partly by whether the people use it and the usage of the PhilHealth, and also on the health, the impact of health, right? So whether the amount of money spent is hard to know. I mean, because the point is that the main objectives of the additional enrollment has taken place. So largely that has been met. Whether in general under-execution has affected healthcare as well, to be honest, I haven't looked at it in very detail, because the big underspending really has been coming in public investment outlays. So yes, there is a bit of healthcare in the capital outlays like clinics, but I would say that maybe the infrastructure has been the one where the under-execution has been the most.
Okay, Amika, perhaps if we have resource persons in the next few days from the DBM, you can ask that question on the expenditure side. We can entertain one more question. Any more? Okay, Mr. Peiris, perhaps for your closing, let me ask you, because normally we are inclined to assess progress in terms of how we fare compared with other economies. So as a resident representative with the Philippines of the IMF, how do you assess the Philippines' performance over the last few years in terms of using fiscal policy as a tool to address income inequality?
Okay, I mean, there's a fairly it's globally recognized right now, Philippines CCT program, especially the kind of expansion we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years, has been it's considered quite remarkable, that the way it has been done, and also, using a fairly unique database, and the kind of speed at which they have actually managed to spend and reach the poor. And there's already some preliminary kind of evaluation, including from PIDS and from World Bank, that it's pretty generally positive, especially on the aspects of, kind of outcomes of health outcomes of the participants, which was one of the objectives. So that's been overall, you do see poverty has come down. Yes, there was a bit of a setback in the last poverty survey, but if you look at the incomes of the poorer segment actually increased. The issue was that the prices paid, especially for rice, went up and kind of negated the income growth of the poor. So I would say in general, kind of the fiscal policies approach has been positive, except probably on the rice policy, which has been, was one of the reasons why poverty went up last time. So maybe our area to focus a bit on, overall on the CCTs and on the tax side, I think we've done quite well. Maybe an area we have to focus a bit more is on agriculture and rice policy from a poverty inequality perspective.
Okay, on that note, we are ending our press conference for today. Thank you very much, Mr. Peiris, for your participation. So to our media friends, we'll see you again tomorrow. I'll try to pull out some more delegates for our noon and the late afternoon press conferences. Thank you.